Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Well, this is one of those ones that from the very beginning, from the first time I did an extra history reaction, people have been asking me for me to do Admiral Yi. So here we go. It's a 5-part series, not counting their extra, like their lies episode and things like that. I'm gonna do the first 2 today, and then maybe either 2 or all 3 with the next part, just because I'll be honest, I know very little about this topic. I know that he was a Korean admiral who won a number of just unbelievable victories against the Japanese. I know there have been some movies made about him, and that's really about it. I think he was in the 16th century. So I'm here to learn, and hopefully you guys can share with me what you've learned. Obviously, you guys have been amazed by this story, or you wouldn't keep recommending it to me. So we're going to dive right into it, and honestly, just tell you up front, this is not a reaction video where I'm going to add a lot about what I know, because I don't know really much of anything. So I'm just going to be reacting, maybe offering a tidbit here and there, but let's learn together. Let's dive into Admiral Yi. Dramatic entrance.
The year is 1572, 26 years earlier. A 28-year-old man rides across an open plain. A group of military men stand quietly, observing. His horse stumbles. He's thrown. At first, everybody watching thinks he's dead. His leg is horribly bent, broken. But after a moment, he gets up, dragging one leg behind him, and pulls himself to a willow tree. He binds his leg with its branches, remounts his horse, and finishes the military examination. He fails the exam anyway, but 4 years later he'll be back. He'll pass, and so will begin the career of one of the most glorious admirals of all time. It's strange that this man even decided to join the military. Korea had known 200 years of relative peace, threatened only by the occasional raids from the Jurchen tribes on the northern border and pirate crews plying the nearby sea.
I just want to stop and take a moment once again and say how much I appreciate the way that Extra Credits tells a story. Some of you have been telling me some complaints about some of their more recent stuff. I haven't really dealt with that issue, and honestly, I'm not really concerned about it. But the stuff that I'm watching, I love how they tell a story. I think they are telling a historical story, but they're doing so in a way that's just not about facts and information, that really helps you to understand the feelings and emotions and thought processes and things like that are going on. I just think they really do this well.
The military was not a highly respected career choice for a man of noble birth. Taking the civil service exams and joining the ranks of the Confucian court was a much better way to achieve power and success. And yet this man, Yi Sun-shin, though he was schooled in the Confucian texts, had dreamed of being a soldier since he was a little boy. And so at last, when he had passed the military exam, he was appointed to a desolate fort along the northern border. While most of the border forts were pits of corruption, seen simply as a place to dump individuals who had fallen out of favor with the court, Yi drilled his men rigorously and refortified his post, bringing it up to true readiness in case of an attack. One day, the provincial governor came by to inspect the post. This was a man all of the fort commanders dreaded, known for his harsh punishments and brutal discipline. But when he came to Yi, he simply said, well done, and moved on. Shortly thereafter, Yi was moved back to Seoul, a sign of growing favor, and he was given a post at the military academy there, training new recruits. He was by all accounts rigorous, diligent, and incorruptible. And this was exactly the problem. At this time, the military academy was actually a tool for younger noble sons to jump up the ranks quickly, and for courtiers to channel their favorite people into the cushiest assignments.
Yeah, and so, this is not unique to Korea by any stretch of the imagination. This is what's going on all over the place. We are at a time in history in the 1500s where, by and large, the military establishment is still run by people of noble birth. And so it had nothing to do with your ability as a commander, and had everything to do with what family you were born into and what position you had. So if you were a high-ranking noble, you were going to get positions of great responsibility and authority, whether you had any business in that situation or not. And so, in places like in the West, for example, it's really like when you get into the English Civil War with Cromwell's New Model Army, where you start to see people being given positions in the military because of their skill as leaders and not because of who their father was.
And Yi was not cooperating. So, after a short stay in Seoul, he was booted back to a provincial assignment. By July, though, he had secured a position running a naval garrison and was rapidly rising up the ranks again. But here, too, he was schemed against by corrupt officials. Many attempts were made to have Yi removed, but each one he parried expertly until, one day, one of his previous superiors from the military academy, one who Yi had rebuked for corruption, was called to his province to do an inspection. Seeing an opportunity for revenge, the inspector wrote a report castigating Yi, saying he was completely negligent. When the report got to Seoul, Yi found himself dismissed from the military entirely.
Jeez.
4 months later, though, he was vindicated. Found innocent of the charges against him, he was returned to service, but demoted to the lowest possible officer grade.
Now, a lot of people going through this, especially people who are of nobility and have probably lots of other options as far as what they could do with their lives, have a comfortable, cushy life somewhere. A lot of people would have taken that as a sign, you know what, people are against me, it's unfair, I'm done. But I'm guessing that this guy, if he's the kind of person that achieves the things that he does, is probably a person of great character who's going to fight his way back up the ranks again. We'll see.
He might have languished at this menial post, but at last his diligence was finally rewarded when he was brought back to meaningful duty by none other than one of his former rivals. One of the fleet commanders who Yi had served under while maintaining the naval garrison had been transferred to the northern frontier, and knowing that he'd need good, capable officers, he requested Yi be sent with him.
Good for him.
Soon, though, it became clear that Yi was needed to garrison a fort on the Tumen River, which was one of the demarcation lines between Jurchen and Korean territory. Jurchen raiders roamed far south of the Korean border, looting and pillaging at will. Raids had nearly overrun the nearby frontier province, and so Yi took up the post. He drilled his troops until they were in top shape, and knowing that simply shoring up the defenses wouldn't be enough, he laid his troops out for an ambush and then lured the raiders into Korean territory.
So this is interesting because, all along I've been thinking, okay, we call him Admiral Yi. And if you're not familiar, and I don't know a lot about Asian culture and things like that, but I do know that typically their names go surname first and then their given name. So Yi being Yi Sun Shin, I think is his name. Yi would be his last name, even though it comes first. So he's actually, his first combat looks like it's going to be on land. So interesting, he was also a land commander.
He fell on them with a ferocity and a swiftness they had never seen in Korea. Within hours, the tribes were smashed and their power shattered. They would never again be such a threat to the province. But here, too, Yi was stymied by a jealous superior, and while the court was jubilant about his success, the official record reads, although the court recognized Yi Sun-shin's meritorious service to the king, it nevertheless decided against awarding him a prize. Shortly after this...
Even though he did a great job, and we all recognize that he did a great job, we're not going to do anything about it. Jeez.
Yi's father died, and being deeply rooted in Confucian ideals, Yi retired home for 3 years in accordance with the traditional mourning period.
Wow.
When he at last returned to service, he was put in charge of transportation for the court, but a mere 16 days later, it was decided that Yi was needed too badly at the border, and once again he was sent north. He was to man a small island fortress. Undermanned, crumbling, beyond disrepair, he once again drilled its garrison, shored up its defenses, and week after week sent out a request to the district commander for reinforcements. Then, one morning, as the mists rolled in and most of the men were out harvesting rice because the military was in such a state that men on the border had to harvest their own food, the Jurchen attacked, pouring out of the mist on horseback. Yi Sun-shin only had a dozen men to defend with. He and his handful of soldiers fought desperately, cutting their way to one group of captives and escaping with 50 people the Jurchen would have taken prisoner. But by this time, you know the story. In order to avoid blame, Yi's superior, a man named Yi-il, blamed the entire defeat.
Wonder if he's a relative of some kind with the name Yi-il.
On Yi Sun-shin. He had him brought back to the capital, tortured, and put on trial in an attempt to have him condemned so that Yi-il could avoid any of the blame.
So once again, a lesser person would have been, I'm done with this military command. I'm done with having to compete with all of these people who are jealous of my success. I would not want any part of this, but this guy keeps pressing through. It's impressive.
But Yi Sun-shin did not crack under torture, and when it came time to take the stand, he said this to Yi Il. My lord, you are asking me to assume the whole responsibility for the misfortune, but you are wrong. May I remind you that you have always refused my frequent request for reinforcement. The defeat was not a result of my negligence of duty, but in large part, your fault. Therefore, it is not I, but you, who should be held responsible for the defeat. The court was stunned.
That was gutsy.
Many of them knew of Yi's record and were inclined to believe him, so in the end, he was allowed to live, but he was stripped of his rank, again, and returned to the army as a common enlisted man, starting...
He went back to the army as an enlisted man? I mean, that is serious demotion. Wow.
Over at the very bottom, as if he'd never taken the military examinations. He was once again placed on the northern border and asked to fight the invading tribes, and once again he did so with distinction, until finally in 1588 he asked that he be allowed to retire. But storm clouds were gathering over Korea, and some, especially his longtime friend, a man named Ryu Sung-young, recognized that soon the country would have need of good military men. While Yi had struggled through his career in the military, Ryu, his childhood compatriot, who had been his companion in games of war, had risen to be Prime Minister of Korea. It was actually through Ryu's influence, and because of his subtle aid, that Yi had time and again survived the machinations held against him.
So even though he's had enemies all the way along that keep knocking him down several pegs and keeping him from being able to achieve success, he's also got a friend on his side that recognizes his ability and now is prime minister. So it's nice to have good friends in important places, and that, like they said, that's probably what kept him alive.
Now, Ryu planned to see that Yi would take his rightful place for the war he feared was coming. On the next episode of Extra History, remember how in the Sengoku Jidai episodes we talked about that messy Japanese invasion of Korea? Well, that's about to happen. Join us as Yi and Ryu take on the Japanese forces.
All right, so let's go ahead and dive right into part 2. I'm fascinated. I'm interested because I know that what he's remembered for are his naval victories against the Japanese. So I guess we're going to start to get into that. And I'm really curious to learn more about this story. So let's go ahead and right into part 2.
At last, we've passed the phase of Yi's life where his every effort is thwarted by the machinations of corrupt officials and jealous superiors. Finally, we can begin the story that sees Yi rise to be the national hero of Korea. But first, we have to talk about the two contrasting states that are about to meet in bloody battle. If you watched the Sengoku Jidai episodes, you'll remember that Japan had just come out of 100 years of ceaseless war. Their entire society was built off of a martial hierarchy, where the most glorious thing a man could do was fight.
And so this is interesting because we learned in the last episode that in Korean culture, the military was not viewed as something noble to be aspired to. So you have very competing cultures here, whereas in Japanese culture, it's a different story. And you would think, at least on the surface, that a culture that values and praises the nobility of fighting and being in the military would have an advantage over one that doesn't.
Japan had fielded giant armies and had an economy devoted to war. They had hundreds of thousands of veteran soldiers, and they had seasoned generals, battle-hardened from years of campaigning. And now, for the first time ever, all those forces were unified under one man, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The Korean state had, by contrast, been mostly at peace for 200 years. The state itself was a Confucian bureaucracy, which should have meant that it was an enlightened meritocracy, but in truth, the Korean government was rotten to its core, full of factional infighting and led by a king who perhaps might have been a great leader in times of peace, but was utterly unsuited for a state of war. In terms of military thinking, the Japanese had spent years perfecting the art of war. The daimyos had become early adopters of the arquebus, and had rapidly innovated on firearm manufacturing and tactics.
And so that, again, goes against the typical assumption that people make about the Japanese, which is that they're all about the samurai and the sword and kind of sticking to the ways of the past and not advancing with the future. But no, they're using the modern firearm that is available at that time. And this is the early days of the arquebus and things of that nature, the early firearms, and they've got them already. So interesting.
They had created movable field works to protect their gunners, coordinated the use of spears and arquebusiers, drilled the men to release large, simultaneous volleys to break up a charge, and trained them to wait to fire until they were within an effective range. They were such enthusiastic adopters of the arquebus that when the Japanese eventually arrived on Korean shores, about a quarter of their total force would be armed with this fearsome weapon. The Japanese had also become masters of the siege after so many decades of having to topple the highly wrought, master-crafted Japanese castles of the Sengoku Age. The Koreans, on the other hand, had largely ignored the introduction of personal firearms and still relied mainly on the bow. But because the bow is a weapon that requires a great deal of training and the Korean military was in a dissipated state, the actual number of effective troops they could field with this weapon was now very limited. The lists of who they could call to military service were all out of date, and so the initial mustering of forces would lag behind, and Korean defensive works were mostly just simple stone walls atop hills or mountains. But the Koreans did have two advantages. Since the war that had been burning through Japan for the last 100 years was a civil war, and thus mostly land-based, Japan hadn't built up its navy nearly as much as their other armed forces. Additionally, while Japan produced vastly superior handguns, the Koreans had developed better naval cannon. And this all makes sense when you think about what both of these forces were used to facing. Japanese forces were used to fighting large, organized land armies, and so they'd focused on developing the weapons and techniques required to counter them, whereas Korea had mostly dealt with pirates and raiders, so they'd built cannon to help defend their coast, and they'd built simple hill forts so that when raiders showed up, the people could hide in the forts and simply wait for the raiders to go away.
So this brings up an interesting point, and this is kind of how history has gone when you deal with, for example, I'm not saying Japan's a superpower here, but there have been situations throughout history where large, powerful nations haven't been able to defeat smaller, seemingly weaker ones with a weaker military, and it's often because of the nature of the conflict. The United States, for all its military power, could not win a war in Vietnam where the nature of the conflict was what it was, with fighting in the jungle and guerrilla warfare and, those sorts of things. Same thing with the Soviets in Afghanistan, very much the same situation. And so here you have one that's got on paper everything going for it in Japan, and Korea everything going against it, but the two advantages they have are the key advantages they're going to need to win a war of the nature of the kind they're about to face.
They didn't need complex structures because the enemy Korea usually faced wasn't an enemy bent on conquest, but that was about to change. Between 1587 and 1592, emissaries raced back and forth between Japan and Korea. Hideyoshi wanted the Koreans to just let him march his armies through their lands in order to attack his intended target, China. But besides the fact that letting giant foreign armies march across your country is generally a bad idea, the Koreans also happened to be tributary allies of the Chinese with strong cultural and economic ties, so letting this army march through uncontested was out of the question. This whole thing seemed like madness to them. The idea that the Japanese would even ask for such a thing was unfathomable to many in court. At first, they assumed the request must be a bluff, maybe a negotiating tactic that would eventually end in the Japanese asking for trade concessions or tribute or something. But Ryu Song-yong saw further, to what was really about to go down. And so he got Yi a naval appointment in the southwestern part of Korea and helped to make sure that he rose rapidly through the ranks.
So interesting. A guy whose entire career has been on land is tapped by the prime minister to rise through the ranks and lead the naval forces. This is a guy who recognizes the intelligence and the prowess of Yi, no matter what situation he's put into. Because, boy, this is a completely different nature of warfare.
Becoming the naval commander for the province by 1591. This is where Yi's story really begins. Upon taking command, Yi saw the dire straits the Navy was in and knew he had little time. He began drilling his men and instilling in them the spirit they needed for the war to come. He commissioned a new type of ship, the famous turtle ship, which he helped design. It was a remarkable piece of naval technology, with a spiked roof to keep enemy boarding parties out, and a dragon head prow that could serve as a cannon or billow out noxious smoke. But even before the first of these ships could see active service, it happened. Sentries all across the southeast coast began to spot ships coming over the horizon. Then tens of ships. Then hundreds. This massive fleet flew no sails known to Korean arms. Fires were lit and word was spread. The Japanese were coming. But the local commanders refused to believe what they were seeing. They suggested that maybe it was a trade fleet, or maybe even a large tribute mission from the Japanese to apologize for how rude their ambassadors had been.
They're not invading, they're coming to apologize. No wonder Yi rose to prominence. Look at the incompetence of the other people.
And so, the local commanders did nothing. The approaching ships began to dock at Busan. Soldiers, fully armored and prepared for war, began to disembark from the ships, and still the local commanders did nothing. By nightfall, 300 ships full of warriors had landed.
So compare this, and because I don't know a lot about this topic, I'm looking for parallels and other things like that. A while back, we watched a video of the sinking of the German ship Blücher, and how the colonel who was commanding the fort there made a decision to fire on ships that he could only see silhouettes of in the darkness. And other people were like, are you sure you want to do this? And he said, these are ships that are coming under cover of darkness without warning in the middle of the night, and they're not friendly. Yes, they're enemy. We're firing. Compare that to these guys who refuse to do anything. Even after the invasion force starts landing in their territory, they still do nothing.
Japanese army was now in Korea. Finally, the commanders realized what had just happened, but by now it was far too late. With well over 100 heavy Korean ships of war at the ready, they had just sat and watched this happen without even moving a single one of those ships out to scout the fleet. If they had, they would have found out that this was a Japanese commander acting against orders. Eager to be the first to Korea, he had sailed his fleet before their warship arrived. Turns out nearly all of those hundreds of ships were unarmed transports. No match for the Korean Navy, which still sat anchored at port doing nothing. The Japanese force moved like lightning, smashing army after army, crushing all in their way. Within the month, the Japanese were already in Seoul, 200 miles inland. Korean resistance had collapsed. And as the Japanese had pushed inland and moved out of Busan, the local commanders had scuttled their fleets. 100 Korean warships lost without a fight. But Busan's local commanders had sent word to Yi, asking for his help. So Yi set out with all 24 ships under his command, writing to other local commanders and telling them to rendezvous with him at sea. He left under cover of darkness and sailed through the night so his movements wouldn't be observed. By the time the various fleets met, they'd scraped together 45 warships and a handful of commandeered fishing ships. But Yi, despite never having commanded a battle at sea before, had a plan. He would fall on the...
Yi always has it, but I couldn't help it. I was waiting for that because, after watching the Bismarck series, Bismarck always has a plan. Yi has a plan.
Japanese while they were in harbor during the chaos of a sack. He found 50 of their vessels tied up at Okpo and descended upon them. The Japanese were mostly away from their ships at the time, looting and slaughtering the population. The roar of cannon alerted them to their mistake.
Oops.
Yi and his fleet tore through the enemy ships, salvo after salvo ripping into the light wood of the Japanese vessels. The Japanese tried to mount a defense, but to no avail. Soon their men were throwing their weapons and armor overboard and trying to swim for the shore. By nightfall, 26 Japanese ships rested at the bottom of the harbor. Only one Korean sailor was injured.
Dang.
Yi decided to disappear back into open water before his forces fell into the same trap he'd just sprung on his enemy. But as they sailed, one of his outlying ships spotted 5 more Japanese warships. Yi fell upon them with a vengeance. Only one managed to escape. Then new reports came in of 13 more ships near Chinhae. When the sailors on those ships saw Yi, they abandoned their vessels entirely and fled on foot into the mountains. 43 Japanese ships sunk, and Yi had not lost a single vessel.
Nice start. Nice start for a guy who's never really commanded ships in combat before, and who's going up against a superior force that is supposed to have everything going for it.
He was promoted to General Command of the Southern Navy for his actions, but the sight of Japanese slaughtering civilians would stick with him forever, and harden his resolve to defend the people of Korea. Join us next time as everyone else in Korea keeps losing, and Admiral Yi keeps winning.
Very cool. I am interested. I'm excited to continue this man's story tomorrow. We'll get into the next couple of episodes. But let me know your thoughts about all of this. Many of you have obviously already seen it because you've been recommending it to me. But pretty cool, and I'm curious to learn more and see what else I can find out. As always, make sure that you head on over through the link in the description to the original content creator. Give them a like. Subscribe if you haven't already. There's a lot of great stuff on there, and it's not all history stuff. They've got a lot of other topics as well. Hit like on this one if you would, and consider joining our team as a patron. I would greatly appreciate that. Thanks. We'll see you again tomorrow.